Hi everyone, welcome to Ahila's story reading session. Today I am going to read a story from Jim Corbett's Man Eaters of Kumaun. You all know that Jim Corbett is a naturalist, once a hunter, a best writer of animal stories, and he wrote many stories about tigers and his hunting episodes. And he mentioned in his author's note, a man-eating tiger is a tiger that has been compelled through stress of circumstances beyond its control to adopt a diet alien to it. The stress of circumstances is 9 out of 10 cases wounds, and in the 10th sense case old age. So that's the cause for the tiger, man-eating tigers. So for that the hunting is necessary, as they are attempt to kill people, animals, cattle and all those things. So he had written so many stories about the tiger hunting in the central India and western Indias on those days. So I am going to read you about the Bachelor of Pavalgarh. Pavalgarh is an area. So I am going to read about that story so you can listen to that. It's about Jim Corbett's experience in his own writing. You can enjoy it, right? Yes. The Bachelor of Pavalgarh. 3 miles from our winter home and in the heart of the forest, there is an open glade some 400 yards long and half as wide, grassed with emerald green and surrounded by big trees interlaced with cane creepers. It was in this glade, which for beauty has no equal, that I first saw the tiger who was known throughout the United Provinces as the Bachelor of Pavalgarh, who from 1920 to 1930 was the most sought after big game trophy in the province. The sun had just risen one winter's morning when I crested the high ground overlooking the glade. On the far side, a score of red jungle fowl were scratching among the dead leaves bordering a crystal clear stream, and scattered over the emerald green grass, now sparkling with dew, 50 or more chital were feeding. Sitting on a tree stump and smoking, I had been looking at this scene for some time when the hen nearest to me raised her head, turned in my direction and called, and a moment later the bachelor stepped into the open from the thick bushes below me. For a long minute he stood with head held high, surveying the scene, and then with slow, unhurried steps started to cross the glade. In his rich winter coat, which is the newly risen sun was lighting up, he was a magnificent sight with head turning now to the right and now to the left. He walked down the wide lane the deer had made for him. At the stream he lay down and quenched his thirst, and then sprang across, and as he entered the dense tree jungle beyond, called 3 times in acknowledgment of the homage the jungle folk had paid him. For from the time he had entered the glade, every chital had called, every jungle fowl had cackled, and every one of the troop of monkeys on the trees had chattered. The bachelor was far afield that morning, for his home was in a ravine 6 miles away. Living in an area in which the majority of tigers are back with the aid of elephants, he had chosen his home wisely. The ravine running into the foothills was half a mile long, with steep hills on either side, rising to a height of 1,000 feet. At the upper end of the ravine, there was a waterfall some 20 feet high, and at the lower end, where the water had cut through the red clay, it narrowed to 4 feet. Any sportsman, therefore, who wished to try conclusions with the bachelor while he was at home would of a necessity have to do so on foot. It was this secure retreat and the government rules prohibiting night shooting that had enabled the bachelor to retain possession of his much sought after skin. In spite of the many and repeated attempts that had been made to back him with the aid of buffalo bait, the bachelor had never been fired at, though on 2 occasions to my knowledge he had only escaped death by the skin of his teeth. On the first occasion, after a perfect beat, a guy rope by which the match-on was suspended interfered with the movement of Fred Anderson's rifle at the critical moment. On the second occasion, the bachelor arrived at the match-on before the beat started and found Huishedge flipping his pipe. On both of these occasions, he had been viewed at a range of only a few feet, and while Anderson described him as being as big as a Shetland pony, Eddie said he was as big as a donkey. The winter following these and other unsuccessful attempts, I took Wyndham, our commissioner, who knows more about tiger than any other man in India, to a fire track skirting the upper end of the ravine in which the bachelor lived, to show him the fresh pug marks of the tiger which I had found on the fire track that morning. Wyndham was accompanied by 2 of his most experienced shikaris, and after 3 of them had carefully measured and examined the pug marks, Wyndham said that in his opinion the tiger was 10 feet between pugs, and while one shikari said he was 10 inch and 5 over curves, and the other said he was 10 inch and 6 over, or little more. All 3 agreed that they had never seen the pug marks of a bigger tiger. In 1930, the Forest Department started extensive fellings in the area surrounding the bachelor's home, and annoyed at the disturbance, he changed his quarters. This I learned from 2 sportsmen who had taken out a shooting pass with the object of hunting down the tiger. The shooting passes are only issued for 15 days of each month, and throughout that winter, shooting party after shooting party failed to make contact with the tiger. Towards the end of the winter, an old DAC runner who passes our gate every morning and evening on his 7-mile run through the forest to a hill village came to me one evening and reported that on his way out that morning he had seen the biggest pug marks of a tiger that he had seen during the 30 years of his service. The tiger, he said, had come from the west, and after proceeding along the road for 200 yards had gone east, taking a path that started from near an almond tree. This tree was about 2 miles from our home and was a well-known landmark. The path the tiger had taken runs through very heavy jungle for half a mile before crossing a wide watercourse, and then joins a cattle track which skirts the foot of the hills before entering a deep, well-wooded valley, a favorite haunt of tigers. Early next morning, with Robin at my heels, I set out to prospect, my objective being the point where the cattle track entered the valley, for at this point the tracks of all the animals entering or leaving the valley are to be found. So from the time we started, Robin appeared to know that we had a special job at hand, and he paid not the least attention to the jungle fowl we disturbed, the cuckoo that let us quite close to it, and the 2 sambar that stood and belled at us. Where the cattle track entered the valley, the ground was hard and stony, and when we reached this spot, Robin put down his head and very carefully smelled the stones, and on receiving a signal from me to carry on, he turned and started down the track, keeping a yard ahead of me. I could tell from his behavior that he was on the scent of a tiger, and that the scent was hot. 100 yards further down, where the track flattens out and run along the foot of the hill, the ground is soft. Here I saw the pug marks of a tiger, and a glance at them satisfied me we were on the heels of the bachelor and that he was only a minute or two ahead of us. So beyond the soft ground, the track runs for 300 yards over stones before going steeply down onto an open plain. If the tiger kept to the track, we should probably see him on this open ground. We had gone another 50 yards when Robin stopped, and after running his nose up and down from the blade of grass on the left of the track, turned and entered the grass, which was here about 2 feet high. On the far side of the grass, there was a patch of clerodendron about 40 yards wide. This plant grows in dense patches to a height of 5 feet and has widely spread leaves and a big head of flowers, not unlike horse chestnut. It is greatly fancied by tiger, sambar and pig because of the shade it gives. When Robin reached the clerodendron, he stopped and backed towards me, thus telling me that he could not see into the bushes ahead and wished to be carried. Lifting him up, I put his hind legs into my left-hand pocket, and when he had hooked his 4 feet over my left arm, he was safe and secure, and I had both hands free for the rifle. On these occasions, Robin was always in deadly earnest, and no matter what he saw or how our quarry behaved before and after fired at, he never moved or spoilt my shot or impeded my view. Proceeding very slowly, we had gone halfway through the clerodendron when I saw the bushes directly in front of us swaying. Waiting until the tiger had cleared the bushes, I went forward, expected to see him in the more or less open jungle. But he was nowhere in sight, and when I put Robin down, he turned to the left and indicated that the tiger had gone into the deep and narrow ravine nearby. This ravine ran to the foot of an isolated hill on which there were caves frequented by tigers. And as I was not armed to deal with the tiger at close quarters, and further as it was time for breakfast, Robin and I turned and made for home. After breakfast, I returned alone and armed with heavy .450 rifle, and as I approached the hill, which in the days of long ago had been used by the local inhabitants as a rallying point against the Gurkha invaders. These sounds were coming from the top of the hills, which is flat and about half an acre in extent. So I climbed up and saw a man on a tree striking a dead branch with the head of his axe and shouting, while at the foot of the tree a number of buffaloes were collected. When he saw me, the man called out, saying I had just arrived in time to save him and his buffaloes from a shaitan of a tiger the size of a camel that had been threatening them for hours. From his story, I gathered that he had arrived on the hill shortly after Robin and I had left home, and that as he started to cut the bamboo leaves for his buffaloes, he saw a tiger coming towards him. He shouted to drive the tiger away as he had done on many previous occasions with other tigers. But instead of going away, this one had started to growl. He took to his heels, followed by his buffaloes, and climbed up the nearest tree. The tiger, paying no heed to his shout, had then set to pacing round and round, while the buffaloes kept their heads towards it. Probably the tiger had heard me coming, for it had left only a moment before I had arrived. The man was an old friend who, before his quarrel with the headman of his village, had done a considerable amount of poaching in these jungles with the headman's gun. He now begged me to conduct both himself and his cattle safely out of the jungle. So telling him to lead on, I followed behind to see that there were no stragglers. At first, the buffaloes were disinclined to break up their close formation, but after a little persuasion, we got them to start, and we had gone halfway across the open plain I have alluded to when the tiger called in the jungle to our right. The man quickened his pace, and I urged on the buffaloes for a mile of very thick jungle lay between us and the wide open watercourse beyond which lay my friend's village and safety for his buffaloes. I have earned the reputation of being keener on photographing animals than on killing them. And before I left my friend, I begged me to put aside photography for this one and kill the tiger, which he said was big enough to eat a buffalo a day and ruin him in 25 days. I promised to do my best and turned to retrace my steps to the open plain to meet with an experience every detail of which has burnt itself deep into my memory. On reaching the plain, I sat down to wait for the tiger to disclose his whereabouts or for the jungle folk to tell me where he was. It was then about 3 p.m. and as the sun was warm and comforting, I put my head down on my drawn-up knees and had been dozing a few minutes when I was awakened by the tiger calling. Thereafter, he continued to call at short intervals. Between the plain and the hills, there is a belt, some half a mile wide, of the dense scrub jungle for 100 miles round. And I located the tiger as being on the hills on the far side of the scrub, about 3/4 of a mile from me. And from the way he was calling, it was evident he was in search of a mate. Starting from the upper left-hand corner of the plain and close to where I was sitting, an old cart track, used some years previously for extracting timber, ran in an almost direct line to where the tiger was calling. This track would take me in the direction of the calling animal, but on the hills with high grass and without Robin to help me, there would be a little chance of my seeing him. So instead of me going to look for the tiger, I decided he should come and look for me. I was too far away for him to hear me, so I sprinted up the cart track for a few hundred yards, laid down my rifle, climbed at the top of the high tree and called 3 times. I was immediately answered by the tiger. After climbing down, I ran back, calling as I went, and arrived on the plain without having found a suitable place in which to sit and await the tiger. Something would have to be done and done in a hurry, for the tiger was rapidly coming nearer. So, after rejecting a little hollow which I found to be full of black stinking water, I lay down flat in the open 20 yards from where the track entered the scrub. From this point, I had a clear view of the track for 50 yards to where a bush leaning over it impeded my further view. If the tiger came down the track as I expected him to, I decided to fire at him as soon as he cleaned the obstruction. After opening the rifle to make quite sure it was loaded, I threw off the safety catch and with the elbows comfortably resting on the soft ground, waited for the tiger to appear. I had not called since I came out of the plain, so to give him direction, I now gave a low call which he immediately answered from a distance of 100 yards. If he came on its usual pace, I judged he would clear the obstruction in 30 seconds. I counted this number very slowly and went on counting up to 80 when out of the corner of my eye I saw a movement to my right front where the bushes approached to within 10 yards of me. Turning my eyes in that direction, I saw a great head projecting above the bushes, which here were 4 feet high. The tiger was only a foot and 2 inside the bushes, but all I could see of him was his head. As I very slowly swung the point of the rifle round and ran my eyes along the sides, I noticed that his head was not quite square onto me. As I was firing up, he was looking down. I aimed an inch below his right eye, pressed the trigger, and for the next half an hour nearly died of fright. Instead of dropping dead as I expected him to, the tiger went straight up into the air above the bushes for his full length, falling backwards onto a tree a foot thick, which had been blown down in a storm and was still green. With unbelievable fury, he attacked this tree and tore it to bits, emitting as he did so roar upon roar, and what was even worse, a dreadful blood curdling sound as though he was savaging his worst enemy. The branches of the tree tossed about as though struck by a tornado, while the bushes on my side shook and bulged out, and every moment I expected to have him on top of me, for he had been looking at me when I fired and knew where I was. Too frightened even to recharge the rifle, for fear the slight movement and sound should attract the attention of the tiger, I lay and sweated for half an hour with my finger on the left trigger. At last the branches of the tree and the bushes ceased waving about, and the roaring became less frequent, and eventually, to my great relief, ceased. For another half hour I lay perfectly still, with arms cramped by the weight of the heavy rifle, and then started to pull myself backwards with my toes. After progressing for 30 yards in this manner, I got to my feet, and crouching low, made for the welcoming shelter of the nearest tree. Here I remained for some minutes, and as all was now silent, and I turned and made for home. Next morning, I returned accompanied by one of my men, an expert tree climber. I had noticed the previous evening that there was a tree growing on the edge of the open ground and about 40 yards from where the tiger had fallen. We approached this tree very cautiously, and I stood behind while the man climbed to the top. After a long and careful scrutiny, he looked down and shook his head, and when he rejoined me on the ground, he told me that the bushes over a big area had been flattened down, but the tiger was not in sight. So I sent him back to his perch on the tree with the instructions to keep a sharp lookout, and warned him if he saw any movement in the bushes, and went forward to have a look at the spot where the tiger had reached. He had reached to some purpose, for in addition to tearing branches and great strips of wood off the tree, he had torn up several bushes by the roots and bitten down others. Blood in profusion was sprinkled everywhere, and on the ground were two pools of blood, near one of which was lying a bit of bone 2 inches square, which I found on examination to be part of tiger's skull. No blood trail led away from this spot, and this, combined with the two pools of blood, was proof that tiger was still here when I left, and that the precautions I had taken the previous evening had been very necessary, for when I started my getaway, I was only 10 yards from the most dangerous animal in the world, a freshly wounded tiger. On circling round the spot, I found a small smear of blood here and there on leaves that had brushed against his face. Nothing that these indications of the tiger's passage led in a direct line to a giant simul tree 200 yards away. I went back and climbed the tree my man was on in order to get a bird's eye view of the ground I should have to go over, for I had a very uneasy feeling that I should find him alive. A tiger shot in the head can live for days and can even recover from the wound. True, this tiger had a bit of his skull missing, and as I had never dealt with an animal in this condition before, I did not know whether he was likely to live for a few hours or days, or live on to die of old age. For this reason, I decided to treat him as an ordinary wounded tiger and not to take any avoidable risk when following him up. From my elevated position on the tree, I saw that a little to the left of the line to the simul tree, there were two trees, The nearer one 30 yards from the blood was, and the other 50 yards further on. Leaving my man on the tree, I climbed down, picked up my rifle and a shotgun and a bag of 100 cartridges, and very cautiously approached the nearer tree and climbed up to the height of 30 feet, pulling the rifle and gun, which I had tied to one end of a strong cord, up after me. After fixing the rifle in a fork of the tree, where it would be handy if needed, I started to spray the bushes with a small shot, yard by yard, up to the foot of the second tree. I did this with the object of locating the tiger, assuming he was alive and in that area, for a wounded tiger, on hearing a shot fired close to him or on being struck by a pellet, will either growl or charge. Receiving no indication of the tiger's presence, I went to the second tree and sprayed the bushes to within a few yards of the simule tree, firing the last shot at the tree itself. After this last shot, I thought I heard a low growl. But it was not repeated, and I put it down to my imagination. My bag of cartridges was now empty. So after recovering my man, I called it a day and went home. When I returned next morning, I found my friend, the buffalo man, feeding his buffalo on the plain. He appeared to be very much relieved to see me, and the reason for this I learnt later. The grass was still wet with dew, and we found a dry spot and there sat down to have a smoke and relate our experiences. My friend, as I have already told you, had done a lot of poaching, having spent all his life in the tiger-infested jungles. Tending his buffaloes or shooting, his jungle knowledge was considerable. After I had left him that day at the wide open watercourse, he had crossed to the far side and had sat down to listen for sounds coming from the direction in which I had gone. He had heard two tigers calling. He had heard my shot followed by the continuous roaring of a tiger, and very naturally concluded I had wounded one of the tigers and that it had killed me. On his return next morning to the same spot, he had been greatly mystified by hearing 100 shots fired, and this morning, not being able to contain his curiosity any longer, he had come to see what had happened. Attracted by the smell of blood, his buffaloes had shown him where the tiger had fallen, and he had seen the patches of dry blood and had found the bit of bone. No animal, in his opinion, could possibly live more than few hours after having a bit of his skull blown away, and so sure was he that the tiger was dead that he offered to take his buffaloes into the jungle and find it for me. I heard of this method of recovering tigers with the help of buffaloes, but had never tried it myself, and after my friend had agreed to accepting compensation for any damage to his cattle, I accepted this offer. Rounding up the buffaloes, 25 in number, and keeping to the line I had sprinkled with shot the previous day, we made for the simule tree, followed by the buffaloes. Our progress was slow, for not only had we to move to chin-high bushes with our hands to see where to put our feet, but we also had frequently checked the very natural tendency on the part of the buffaloes to stray. As we approached the simule tree, where the bushes were lighter, I saw a little hollow filled with the dead leaves that had been pressed flat and on which were several patches of blood, some dry, others in the process of congealing, and one quite fresh. And when I put my hand to the ground, I found it was warm. Incredible as it may appear, the tiger had lain in this hollow the previous day while I had expended 100 cartridges and had only moved off when he saw us and the buffaloes approaching. The buffaloes had now found the blood and were pawing up the ground and snorting, and as a prospect of being caught between the charging tiger and the angry buffaloes did not appeal to me, I took hold of my friend's arm, turned him round, and made for the open plain, followed by the buffaloes. When we were back on safe ground, I told the man not to go home, and said I would return next day and deal with the tiger alone. The path through the jungles that I had taken each day when coming from and going home ran for some distance over soft ground, and on this soft ground on this fourth day I saw the pug marks of the tiger, big male tiger. By following these marks, I found the tiger had entered the dense brushwood 100 yards to the right of the simul tree. Here was an unexpected complication, for if I now saw a tiger in this jungle, I should not know, unless I got a very close look at it, whether it was wounded or unwounded one. However, this contingency would have to be dealt with when met, and in the meantime, worrying would not help. So I entered the bushes and made for the hollow at the foot of the simul tree. There was no blood trail to follow, so I zigzagged through the bushes, into which it was impossible to see further than a few inches for an hour or more, until I came to a 10-foot wide dry watercourse. Before stepping down into the watercourse, I look up it and saw the left hind leg of the and tail of a tiger. The tiger was standing perfectly still with its body and head hidden by a tree, and only this one leg is visible. I raised the rifle to my shoulder and then lowered it. To have broken the leg would have been easy, for the tiger was only 10 yards away, and it would have been the right thing to do for if its owner was the wounded animal. But there were two tigers in this area, and to have broken the leg of the wrong one would have doubled my difficulties, which were already considerable. Presently the leg was withdrawn, and I heard the tiger moving away. Going to the spot where he had been standing, I found a few drops of blood. Too late now to regret not having broken that leg. A quarter of a mile further on, there was a little stream, and it was possible that the tiger, now recovering from his wound, was making for the stream, with the object of intercepting him, or failing that, waiting for him at the water. I took a game path, which I knew went to the stream, and had proceeded along it for some distance when a sambar built to my left and went dashing off through the jungle. It was evident now that I was abreast of the tiger, and I had only taken a few more steps when I heard the loud crack of a dry stick breaking, as though some heavy animal had fallen on it. The sound had come from a distance of 50 yards, and from the exact spot where the sambar had built. The sambar had, in unmistakable tones, warned the jungle folk of the presence of a tiger, and the stick therefore could only have been broken by the same animal. So, getting down on my hands and knees, I started to crawl in the direction from which the sound had come. The bushes here were from 6 to 8 feet high, with dense foliage on the upper branches and very few leaves on the stems, so that I could see through them for a distance of 10 to 15 feet. I had covered 30 yards, hoping fervently that if the tiger charged, he would come from in front, for in no other direction would I have fired, when I caught sight of something red, on which the sun, drifting through the upper leaves, was shining. It might only be a bunch of dead leaves. On the other hand, it might be the tiger. I could get a better view of this object from 2 yards to the right, so lowering my head until my chin touched the ground, I crawled this distance with belly to ground, and on raising my head saw the tiger in front of me. So he was crouching down looking at me, with the sun shining on his left shoulder, and on receiving my 2 bullets, he rolled over on his side without making a sound. As I stood over him and ran my eyes over his magnificent proportions, it was not necessary to examine the pads of his feet to know that before me lay the bachelor of Pavalgarh. The entry of the bullet, fired 4 days previously, was hidden by a wrinkle of the skin, and at the back of his head was a big hole, which surprisingly was perfectly clean and healthy. The report of my rifle was, I knew, being listened for, so I hurried home to relieve anxiety, and while I related the last chapter of the hunt and drank a pot of tea, my men were collecting. Accompanied by my sister and Robin and carrying a party of 20 men, I returned to where the tiger was lying, and before he was roped to a pole, my sister and I measured him from nose to tip of tail and from tip of tail to nose. At home, we again assured him to make quite sure we had made no mistake the first time. These measurements are valueless, for there were no independent witnesses present to certify them. They are, however, interesting as showing the accuracy with which experienced woodsmen can judge the length of a tiger from his pug marks. Wyndham, you will remember, said the tiger was 10 feet between pegs, which should give roughly 10 feet 6 inches over curves, and while one shikari said was 10 feet 5.09 inches over curves, and the other said 10 feet 6 inches or a little more. Short 7 years after these estimates were made, my sister and I measured the tiger as being 10 feet 7 inches over curves. I have told the story at some length, and as I feel sure that those who hunted the tiger between 1920 and 1930 will be interested to know how the bachelor of Pavalgarh met his end. So beautiful the story's lines are. And always Jim Corbett wrote out the experiences in a vivid way. And he always explains how the surrounding forest, hills, valleys and the plain may be, and all the cattle feeding and the hill area, the people. Uh, he explains these things in a vivid way in that stories. These are not, we won't consider these as a plain stories of hunting episodes. These are bigger experiences that we have while we are encountering a tiger. In this Pavalgarh, Bachelor of Pavalgarh man-eater tiger, he had experienced as a the nearest encounter. So that's giving us a full insight over about the animals and about the experiences that the man face encounter with the animal. So these things, Jim Corbett's stories are always welcome for his narration. And I will read another one because his stories are so long that it needs so much time. This story took almost 35 minutes for me to read. So this is a short story I found in this book, Man-Eaters of Kumaon. So we'll read another one in a leisure time. See you all in the next episode. Thank you.